There's another piece of video that caught our eye this weekend. Fidel Castro stepped back into the spotlight. He returned to speak at the National Assembly of Cuba for the first time since health problems forced him to step aside. That was 4 years ago. His reappearance has fueled speculation about Cuba's future now, and joining me to talk about it is Tomas Bilbao, Executive Director of the Cuba Study Group in Washington. And we should mention here that Tomas and I have talked Cuba before, so this could go on all afternoon. I'll just warn our viewers here. But thanks for joining us, Tomas. I wanted to ask you, when you saw this video yesterday, I mean, it must have taken you aback as somebody who studies the Cuba issue very closely, studies the issue of whether or not the United States should change its policy toward Cuba. When you saw Fidel step out there, what did you think?
Well, you know, it had been a long time since anyone saw Fidel Castro, especially in a role like this. It had been 4 years since he spoke to the parliament or to in public in Cuba. And really, it reminded people, which I think was the main purpose of him doing it, reminded people that he's still around, that he's recovered from his ailment, and that he's still part of Cuban society, if not part of the government.
And I guess that is the big question, right? Because he ceded power to his brother Raul when he was very ill. And Raul has essentially been running the country and has been, I think you would agree, making some incremental changes in the economy. Some people would obviously like to see vast changes towards a democracy in Cuba. That hasn't happened, obviously. But does this mean that Fidel Castro is perhaps coming back to the scene, may perhaps be more in charge than he has been in recent years? Or was this just sort of a chance to look at the old Fidel?
Well, you know, I think the most important part of Fidel's speech yesterday was actually what he didn't say. He chose to focus on international affairs and made no mention of any of the domestic issues that are plaguing Cuba and that frankly are the main concern of the people. And that would suggest that he's indicating that his brother Raul and Raul's government are in charge of the day-to-day managing of the government, and that he is going to continue to participate as a commentator or an observer, as he's done through his reflexiones, on issues mainly dealing with international affairs. So I think for those of us who follow Cuba and everyone who's concerned with seeing progress and reforms happening in Cuba, I think it's a good indication, and that if he really wanted to derail any of the reforms his brother has begun to put into place, he could have done so just by having very subtle language that would undermine any efforts to reform.
And he didn't do that. What we heard from Fidel is something that we've heard from Fidel lately in the news, which is he has this theory that the United States is somehow going to launch a war against North Korea or Iran, or a combination of the two. And I suppose that will have some folks in Cuba sort of scratching their heads, and certainly has people in the United States scratching their heads.
Yeah, it certainly does. In fact, it sounds like a conspiracy theory right out of your favorite movie, Jim Cotta. It seems as if Fidel is focusing on international affairs, and in this case, something that seems quite far-fetched, and may try to be an effort to distract Cubans from the real problems that they're facing. But I think that that's ultimately going to be ineffective, because I think that the average Cuban is more concerned with their personal freedoms and their economic freedoms and the ability to prosper and take care of their families inside Cuba, rather than any hypothetical war that Fidel suggests may or may not happen in the future.
And Tomas, you saw that in recent weeks, Raul Castro has made the decision to go ahead and free some political prisoners there. Many of those political prisoners have already made their way over to Europe. They're leaving Cuba. And Raul Castro has also, if I'm not mistaken, announced some recent economic moves where he may be laying off scores and scores of government workers in that country, what looks like a privatization of the Cuban workforce. Does that perhaps show a path towards normalization for these two countries? Well, I think that Raul is doing, at least is taking steps to do what they need to do in order to rescue the Cuban economy, which is in shambles, largely because of the failures of the Cuban economic system and the Cuban Revolution. But regardless of whether the Cuban government takes steps or not, the United States government should unilaterally take steps to improve the effectiveness of our policies. The truth is that the reason that Raul decided to release the political prisoners was largely due to pressure internally within Cuba, from Cuba's own civil society. So to the extent the United States can take unilateral steps to embolden civil society, to give them greater strength to push for reforms, I think that ultimately will benefit not just U.S. interests, but also the cause of freedom in Cuba. And just very quickly, just going back to the video that we saw over the weekend, was this really just a glimpse of Fidel in his twilight? Is that essentially what we saw, you think, this weekend?
I think what we saw was an effort of Fidel to rescue whatever he thinks remains of his legacy and make sure that the last images that the world sees of him aren't him in a jumpsuit recovering from an ailment, but rather, as you saw there in his olive military guards, interacting or giving advice to the Cuban government. So it may be an effort on his part to try to rescue what remains of his legacy.
All right, very interesting perspective on that. Tomas Bilbao, always good to talk to you and always good to talk about Cuba. We appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jim.